Perfect. All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Public Legal Education Association of Canada's virtual fair on our final day, day 3. If you haven't joined our session so far, my name is Hannah Holmes. I'm the program director here at PLEAC. Thank you so much for joining today to listen, learn, share knowledge and ideas with one another. Today, we are in particular asking the hot ticket question of what makes for effective PLEA evaluation. Before we begin, just a few things. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that while we are meeting virtually from across the country, I am joining you from Toronto, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Nishnabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land has long been home to diverse Indigenous nations and continues to be a place where many First Nations, Inuit and Métis people live and thrive. So as an organization rooted in justice and education, we do recognize the enduring impacts of colonization and embrace our responsibility to support truth, reconciliation, and meaningful change. And if you've joined us on day 1 or day 2 or both, ideally we will have another 30-minute break today from 1:15 to 1:45. That's Eastern Standard Time. Otherwise, it's 30 minutes after we're done here today to just give everyone a chance to step away, reflect, connect informally, grab a coffee, whatever you need to do. So feel free to do that between our sessions today. And of course, feel free to use the chat and Q&A functions for both our sessions today and share comments, ask questions, engage with one another. We really welcome that. And of course, we'll have time throughout and at the end to try to get to everything that we can. So with that, I would like to introduce our first session titled Learning as We Go, What Makes for Effective PLEA Evaluation. I am delighted to introduce our moderator, Julie Matthews, public legal education researcher, and we'll pass it over to her to introduce our wonderful guest for today. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and hello everyone and welcome. So as Hannah said, in this session, we're talking about evaluating our public legal education services and resources, something we all do in one way or another. We brought an expert in all things public legal education, Lois Gander, to help demystify PLEI evaluation or public legal education evaluation and help us understand how to approach it as something that is doable and helpful rather than complicated and painful. So we are so grateful for Lois for sharing her thoughts. In my view, she is the foremost thinker on public legal education in Canada. She has over 50 years of experience in developing the theory and practice of PLEA in Canada. She witnessed the development of PLEA as it became integral to the Canadian justice system and indeed played a critical role in that development. She has loads of relevant experience. You can see it on the PLEAC website, and I won't spend any more time on that today. So Lois and I would like to have a conversation about PLEA evaluation. I plan to pepper her with a few questions, and we hope that you, the webinar participants, will have questions too. Please pop them in to the chat or question feature at any time, and we'll monitor them and either, give them to Lois as we go or at the end. So let's get rolling, Lois. I'd like to start by asking about the basics. I think it's fair to say that many, if not most, small not-for-profit community organizations, which encompasses most PLEA organizations, find evaluations challenging. They're often both time-consuming and expensive. Why the heck should organizations evaluate their public legal education resources and services? Please answer that hard question.
I'd like to start with a disclaimer. First of all, I am not a professionally trained evaluator. What I am is somebody who has been exposed to evaluation both by doing evaluations of various things and by being having my program subjected to evaluations by other people. So what I have is really very practical knowledge about what's happened and what works and what doesn't work. It, I think, might help you, this discussion, select third-party evaluators if you actually need to go outside your organization. The more you know about it, the more you'll be able to pick the kind of evaluator that actually is needed for what you're trying to do. So I'd also like to start by talking a little bit about why evaluation is so anxiety producing. because it seems to be. First of all, it's expensive and it takes a lot of your time, but if you were getting value from it, you probably wouldn't worry so much about that. But in fact, evaluation practices have evolved over time, and they've started very simply and become very complex, and have been abused. So when I talk about having had my program subjected to third-party evaluations, some of those have been just really awful. Heads of other organizations who were put through the same process either resigned or were fired. The stakes can be very high when you're doing these kinds of evaluations. So of course it's anxiety producing. That said, it's actually something that we do naturally. As Julie said, we all do it in some form. We do it in all aspects of our lives. So we are natural evaluators. We can tell when something's good or bad or working or not working. So I really want to start more from that frame than from the technical professional evaluator frame. It's going to razzle dazzle you with everything that there is that they know about evaluation. So I think, Julie, um, probably useful to talk about why evaluation in terms of some different types of purposes. So sometimes you're doing it to satisfy a funder, and those are generally the most stressful kinds of evaluations. And there's sometimes things you don't know what they're looking for. So you may think you've got a good evaluation, but you've missed something that was actually really important to the funder and you haven't covered it, and therefore there's a problem. So if you can engage with the funder a little bit so you know what they're looking for and can make sure your evaluation suits their needs, that can really help. And it's evolved over time. At one point, all we had to do was give them numbers, number of people who attended sessions, number of sessions we did, number of booklets we produced, what the distribution was. And now it's evolved to more complex kinds of evaluations. In particular, you probably run into impact. They want to know the impact of your program. Some funders are looking for whether you're making systemic change. So you need to really understand what your funder wants, so you're doing the appropriate kind of evaluation from it. Um, then there's community accountability. Like, you've engaged people in this process and they want some feedback on how things have gone. And so you have an obligation to talk to them about how you've managed and whether you've met the goals of the program or didn't, or what the issues might be. But the main type of evaluation that I think we all care most about is program improvement. What can we do better? How did it go? Where were the weak spots? Where were the strengths? What should we build on going forward? And that works where you have ongoing programs. It's less obvious how to use that if it's a short-term, got project funding and it's over. So what? You do all this evaluation, you're never going to do the project again. What's the point of doing it? So the question there would be, again, you may have to provide some information to the funder about how it went, but then what can you learn from that experience that you can then use when you're doing something else? It may be something with the same audience, it may be the same kind of format, it may be the same kind of challenges. Can you transfer that knowledge to the next special project or program that you're doing? Um, so I think we will probably mostly want to spend time talking about what's working, what's not. How can you improve the efficiency of what you're doing? So you've got a program, but maybe it's quite expensive. Is there some way you can trim something, make something more efficient, so that you can reach more people or have a broader impact? Uh, can you improve the effectiveness? It was okay, but you realized coming out of it that maybe there's some things you could do that would actually make it work a little better for people. Expanding the content, addressing specific feedback that people give you. I like this, but not that. Um, and can you replicate it? Is this something you could then replicate in some other way? Um, and then the other reason for evaluating that we don't talk much about is your personal satisfaction. Most of us are doing this kind of work because we want to make a difference. We want to feel that our work is valued and valuable to other people. And so we get that feedback. That's part of this natural evaluation that I think we all experience in one way or another. And I think actually this drives a lot of the other stuff. Like if you weren't feeling satisfied with this, your program evaluation isn't going to have a lot of energy because you just don't believe in it. You don't think it's valuable. You're going to make that decision yourself. You're not going to wait for a funder to, say this isn't working. So I think that personal investment in this is really important and valuable. There is, I think, a downside to that or a flip side to that, in that we probably do get very invested and tend not to want to receive certain kinds of critical information. We like to receive the information that helps us make it better. But if there's information that makes us really have to think whether we're doing the right thing, not just doing things right, but are we actually doing the right thing? We're maybe more resistant to conversations about those. Those are often more uh, theoretical, I guess. I was involved in a conversation recently where the participants said, let's stop talking about access to justice. We're not giving people access to justice at all. We're giving people access to the law. And there are not a lot of people willing to engage in that kind of critical thinking about what they're doing, that they're really facilitating some unjust practices by helping people cope with certain legal processes. So I think we always have to keep in mind that we need to stand back and be critical about what we're doing as well. And that's not necessarily going to come specifically from an evaluation, but it's part of the mindset to bring to really evaluating what we're doing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Go ahead. I was,
yeah,
I was going to move on to the next question,
sure.
unless I'm cutting you off, in which case
No,
continue.
no.
Okay. Well, and Lois, I really like your mention of that personal satisfaction aspect. I don't often hear that, and I think it does matter, even and including that sort of the challenge with getting critical feedback. But um, it's interesting. I think for many of us who work at PLEI organizations, we know from our work day in and day out what's working and what's not. And one of the frustrations can be about evaluations is what can they tell us that we don't already know?
Well, if we could have the next slide, Hannah, if you're managing slides, or Julie. There are various types of evaluations. We talk as if there's only one kind of evaluation and it's telling us what we already know, but it's a way of communicating what we know, because that's really, really important. How do we communicate what we know? But there are different stages in which you might use evaluation in your organization. You might use it very early on to make modifications as you're getting feedback from people. Did a program once where it was a week-long program, and every half day we would evaluate how's it going, what do we need to do, how do we shift, how's it. So we were making those adjustments as we were going along. We weren't recording them. It wasn't like a formal evaluation, but we were getting feedback as we go along. And I think that's one of the important things here is any kind of feedback is good feedback. It doesn't have to be a formal structured program to be evaluation to be useful to you. They have their place, but they're not every place. So the formative evaluation as things are going on is really, really important. And that's how we learned so much about how to do public legal education, was the feedback we got on the spot as we were doing things. Summative is more what we talk about when we think of evaluation, is what happens at the end. At the end, you finish the program. How did it go? What can you say about the program? But there are also process evaluations. How was this a good strategy to use? Were there other things you could have done instead? Did things go the way you thought they would go or not? You can look there at the costs of the program. Do you have a lot of expenses in a category you didn't expect to have them in? Are there things you can do to be more efficient in something, or the costs that you're not going to have if you replicate the program because you've already dealt with that issue and you won't have it anymore? Outcomes is what we talk about more now. What change did you bring about for somebody in whatever your activity was? And these are the things we often talk about with these other kinds of evaluations. And then impact is the new guy on the block, but it's something that funders have really latched on to is so what? What difference are you actually making? What's the long-term impact of providing all this short-term help to people? What's it adding up to? Where is it affecting someplace in the system or how things are happening? So, for example, we did a lot of training for librarians at one point. It led to a change in how library schools dealt with preparing librarians to work with legal materials. At the time we started, there was absolutely, you don't go near this stuff. You don't deal with health problems, you don't deal with legal problems. Well, as a result of the programs we did, we not only helped individual librarians provide better service to individual users, we actually changed how library schools treated this. Okay, so that's an outcome, or that's an impact here where we didn't set out to do that. We didn't say if we do this, guess what? We'll change the training. But we had an impact on the education that librarians were getting. So there are other times like that where you don't necessarily expect to have an impact, but you could have an impact. So I want to come back to this slide 2 to talk about how you might go about assessing this. But Julie, before I do that, are there things about this? I could talk a little bit about developmental evaluation, which is the next slide, and then come back to this if you like, because these are very logical ways of evaluating. Developmental evaluation is again new thinking about evaluation and particularly evaluating innovative service. If you've never done something before, how will you know all the things that some of the other forms of evaluation expect you to know? So this is kind of a structured, rigorous feedback as you go along, as you are discovering things and finding out how to make this innovative service work. So maybe, Julie, do you want me to talk a little bit about indicators now, or do you want more discussion around this?
Oh, Julie, you're muted.
No, I know. Okay, I just like got it right. Yeah. Why don't you say a little bit more about this and then we'll move on to indicators.
About the developmental
Yeah,
evaluation?
yeah, a little bit more.
Yeah. It's a kind of a variation of formative evaluation, but formative evaluation is really where you've done things before and you're tweaking them. Developmental evaluation is much more open-ended. Um, you gather information and feedback as you're going along and make course corrections. You're probably working with partners. It's probably a more dynamic situation than your formative evaluation is. I haven't seen a lot of this done. I've seen people say they're doing it. I'm involved in a program right now that's using developmental evaluation. They use a whole variety of tools along the way to do that, but we haven't completed it, so I'm not sure how that's going to get written up. But that will be my first experience with a professional evaluator who is using this kind of. But the McConnell Foundation in Ontario has developed a guide to help people get started doing this. So particularly if you're heading out in a new direction, something you haven't done at all, you might want to look at developmental evaluation.
Right.
We didn't have that term. We didn't have some of the structure and tools that are now included in this concept, but it's really how we discovered and invented public legal education because we didn't know anything really when we started, and there were a lot of boundaries set by outsiders on what we could and couldn't do. And so we had to push those boundaries and explore ways of using PLEI. And there's still lots of ways of using PLEI that I think are innovative that we don't know what we need when we start, and we have to
Yeah.
get that feedback as we go along.
Well, so, okay, so moving on, I won't make you talk about this. I
Okay.
think people will find this developmental evaluation stuff, though, quite interesting and helpful. So once we've decided what kind of evaluation we're doing, what we want to know, how will we find out, how will we know whether we've achieved what we're aiming to achieve, our goals, our impact, our outcomes.
Okay, let's go back to the previous slide then and talk a little bit about which of those we're talking about. So, um, there are some, how will you know whether you have um, communicated effectively with somebody? How will you know whether you have been very efficient in the use of your resources? How will you know whether you're having a long-term impact? How will you know those sorts of things? So it depends which of type of evaluation, what you're trying to find out, how you will know. And so you have to think that through for each program. What what will tell you what you need to know about that particular program. So is it new information you're communicating to people? Well, then you want to know whether it actually is new information that you're communicating to people. Is it enough that you're communicating it, or do you really want them to understand it or be able to use it? Well, if you want them to be able to use it, you may need to do some exercises to see if they actually can do it. One of the key skills I think we don't talk about enough in PLEI is the ability to listen. You really can learn so much just by listening to people. Um, it wasn't a formal expectation, but one workshop I did recently online had a large number of people present. It was an immigration workshop, and there was a lot of chit chat going on in the chat. Some of the people who knew a lot of stuff were helping other people while this was going on. One of the questions that came up in the chat was, "Oh, I didn't know you couldn't get citizenship automatically by marrying a Canadian citizen." And that is so foundational to the whole thing that it just sort of stopped me in my tracks and going, holy smokes, we didn't start way back there. We didn't start this workshop by talking about that. We didn't have anything on myth busting or anything like that in the workshop. So it was a big insight just to get to see what question people asked. So I think that's really important. What questions are people asking? Are they asking questions that show that they're understanding what you're talking about and want more context or depth or whatever? Or are they asking questions that you thought you'd already answered? And so, or didn't in our case, even think about answering. So listening is an incredibly important skill when you're trying to find out how things are working or not working. Some of the process stuff might be records that you look at. What's your question? Were you on budget? Were you off budget? Um, how did you spend the money in the end? Did you have to go back? Some funders require you to report if you want to spend more than 10% on a category, something like that. Well, did you have to do that? Was your estimate of what you were going to spend way off? So what questions do you have for each of these stages? How will you know whether you had an efficient program? How will you know whether you had if you want to change attitudes, well, you need to talk to people about the attitude. You need to know something about where they came in at. And I often do that in a workshop is say, what are your feelings about uh, the justice system or law or whatever it is that we're talking about, criminal process, and how do you wish you felt? Do you wish you felt more confident? Do you wish you felt that you were going to get a fair hearing? What do you wish? And then see whether when you're done the program, you've moved that at all. Do you feel more confident about
Right.
this? Do you feel more that you understand now what the variables are that will affect the outcome of your situation, whatever it is? So it depends type what type of question you had, then how will you know whether you did that?
And are
That
these, Lois, are these often in evaluation speak, are these called indicators? And a related question is it important to sort of try and make a note of or define or articulate how you will know at the outset so you can sort of monitor it as you go?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of this is funder driven. Again, some forms when you're applying for funder will say what are the indicators? How, and so it's right there. You have to think about it. But the more you think about this up front, the better. And we'll talk a little bit about logic models, but you kind of have to talk about where you want to end up and then work backwards from that to see what you're going to do to get there. And then you can see whether those things did lead you to get there. Did you get anywhere close to where you wanted to be? Or did you end up somewhere wildly different and maybe good place? Like there are always unintended consequences.
Yeah.
As I say, we didn't intend to change how library schools were training librarians. That was not on our radar at all.
Yeah.
So maybe um, the logic model slide might be useful in talking about this too. So a lot of funders got on the logic model bandwagon. Maybe some of you have had that experience with them where you had to provide a logic model. What I've seen happen is that they no longer necessarily ask for a logic model, but they will ask you questions in the funding application that replicate the logic model. But you'll see the arrow at the top, plan backwards. And really, if you're doing a rigorous program proposal, if you're really working this through, that's what you have to do. You have to plan backwards. You don't necessarily start with um, uh, the need, but how are you going to address that need? What impact do you want to have on that? What outcomes do you want to have? And then what do you need to do to get there? What are your inputs and what are the intermediate outputs? Like you're going to need to have a training program. You're going to have brochures. You need to, whatever those activities are going to be. But you really start with what impact you want to have. Why are you doing this program? What impact you want to improve people's ability to deal self-represent in family court. Okay, you want to have that kind of outcome for people. The impact on the courts. I'm old, and back in the day, we used to do a lot of talk about organizing for change. And there was a guy named Saul Alinsky, who was an American who was really famous for some of his radical action. And I think if he was looking at our family law situation, he'd say, you know what you need to do? Just bring on as many cases as you can and just crash the program. Well, that's happened. The courts are swamped. It's not working. They're having to find other ways of. So, did we contribute to that through our public legal education by sending more and more and more people to family court? Maybe we did. Maybe one of the impacts we've had has been to put so much pressure on the system that they've had to come up with different ways of dealing with family law program. And that's not over yet. And we may still be able to influence. And one of the things that I think we undervalue in public legal education is what we learn about people's experiences, that we are often in a position to feed into the system, and other people aren't. So we amass this understanding about how the system's not working. We often can get a place at the table where we can contribute that understanding to discussions of reform. So those are long-term impacts of what we're doing. And the more aware we are that we have that knowledge, the more likely we are to be able to be effective with it.
There's so many different models, aren't there, Lois? And for example, on the logic model, which, from years ago, as you said, but as you said, it continues to sort of visit us in different forms nowadays, but they don't have the indicators or, as one component, which we were talking about a little bit earlier. And we have a question about indicators.
Okay.
So in the context of attitudinal knowledge behavioral change as an anticipated or an expected desired impact, is pre and post program self-reporting of change an acceptable standard of reliable measurement, or in my view, acceptable indicator?
Okay, acceptable and standard are terms I can't address.
Right.
We're still building that knowledge base, but it's certainly an indicator. I think anything that helps you understand the situation is a valid way of doing it. Does that mean that they won't backslide? That today they feel confident, they've done it, but tomorrow all of a sudden they get the jitters again? Well, they might. And so maybe that means that you can't just do a one-off, you feel better at the end of the program, I feel more confident, etc. Maybe you need to do something in 3 months. And this is where cost and resources become a problem because your program may be over before you get a chance to assess that. We don't usually get funders giving us that kind of money so that even though the event is over, we can do follow up. But it's something to try to get money for. And for people who get money from law foundations right now, they seem to have a lot of money. So I think it's a time where if there are things you want to try for evaluation, you might actually be able to get money that you've just assumed isn't going to be available. Another way to follow up on that is key informants, for example. Um, Depending on who you're working with and why, there may be some people who can help you understand that. So, people in the courthouse, for example, will say, we're finding people coming here much more confident about what they're doing. Or they're saying, the odd person is, but really it's not affecting us in any large numbers. But there are other people in your relationship communities that can give you that feedback too.
You're jumping ahead to the next question, Lois.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, and that's okay. So how do we find out? How do we collect information? Who do we talk to? That's practical, easy to manage way to sort of get that sort of feedback from people.
Yeah. Well, and there's the obvious people, the participants and the users, if you can reach them, and any way you can we do feedback forms and those pop-up surveys and things like that. They give you a certain limited amount of information from people, but there are other people that know what's going on that can also give you feedback. Third parties mention judges, but in case, say, you're doing a school program or something, what are the teachers saying? They're saying, you've been to my class for 3 years now, and I'm really noticing this, or um, we just seem to always stumble. The students just don't seem to understand this part of your presentation, or they really like something else. So those are third parties. They're not the kids themselves telling you what they like, but they're the people who have a reason to have some judgment about that can tell you how it's been going on. It's interesting for public legal education generally that after 50 years of doing this, we're still struggling with all of these things. But one thing that we do know is we're still here after 50 years. There are a lot of services started 50 years ago that we don't even remember existed and certainly don't exist now, but we still do. And that's because somebody values us and the right people value us. So judges, lawyers, people who are responsible for processes have found that what we do does help. So that goes back to the self-satisfaction side of this.
Community partners fill that in.
Well, and the community partners that you see, but some of them are gone.
That's true.
Some of our community partners don't exist anymore, but some of them certainly do. And you get new ones who have a reason to believe that what you're doing works. But certainly community partners that are a major source of feedback for you. You've got the relationship. And one of the things about getting feedback that's always been a little bit of a problem is people like to say nice things. And I'm sure the feedback on this workshop is going to be mostly nice things people think, but it's really hard to get the negative feedback from people. And to get that negative feedback, I find you really have to have a relationship, a really trusting relationship, an ongoing relationship where people will start to tell you, but that isn't any good. And so I'm reflecting back to conversation earlier this week about translating materials and how expensive it is to translate materials into all these languages. And my thought on that is, and it's probably a waste of money. Unless you have relationships in those communities where people will really tell you what they need, they probably don't need what you've got translated. They probably need something that's quite different, prepared in a different way, presented in a different way, um, with people that they trust. And so those relationships are absolutely critical to getting the kind of negative feedback you need to really critically assess your activities. You may be wasting a lot of time, even though you get a lot of positive feedback from people. They may go away going, well, yeah, but, I can't actually use this. I don't know how, I don't, whatever. So those collaborators um, then there's just the observers of one sort or another that, depending what your activity is, they may have some insights into how things went. Um, I don't like make too big a deal, but janitors may see all your finely developed materials on the floor that they have to sweep up afterwards because nobody took them home. Uh, your own staff feedback, how did they feel about it? Was there a lot of tension around some particular part of it? Was there some of it that worked really well and they really felt good about doing? And then, as I say, if you're doing some of the other kinds of internal processes, your budget to actuals, your record keeping. Something else that social scientists do that we don't talk about much is field notes. So you're out there and you make your own notes. Like the room was really cold. The sound system was terrible. We had to keep doing whatever. Those field notes are all important parts of evaluating. Three people in the front row were just really, really caught up in it and really seemed to be absorbed in it, and it was really going well for them. Somebody in the back row asked a lot of questions, and I followed up with them afterwards because it obviously was really important to them, and I wanted, those field notes are really, really important source of your information. And along with that are anecdotal and unsolicited comments. You may get a note from somebody, an email afterwards saying that was the best thing. It just answered all the questions I had. Well, you didn't have a formal process for soliciting that, but it's a very valid, comment by somebody. And if you have some kind of survey and you get a really bad result from somebody, well, follow up if you can, figure out who it is, and you often know who that is because of problems during the workshop or whatever. You can follow up and say, okay, what was wrong about this for you? And they may be an outlier. You may not be able to incorporate a lot of what they wanted. It may not represent who you were really trying to reach. But the thing is, the more you learn, the more you can improve what you're doing for everybody. There are a lot of lessons that are transferable, even if that program is terminated. What you've learned about doing things, about listening, about the questions to ask, things that are soliciting uh, information that's helpful to you.
Mhm, mhm. Well, and that was so interesting to hear from you, sort of the array of sources, people we can sort of be paying attention to, and as you said, listening. The challenge then, I think, can be how to collect it in some sort of, systematic way. So what tools, strategies, methods would you suggest we could use?
Um, I think if you can standardize some of your tools, I tried to do that in one context so that we could accumulate, that we ask the same questions about workshops. We ask the same questions about materials. We didn't develop a new handout every time and then tried to like do a spreadsheet and lay these things out so you could see, jeepers, we're just never getting really good marks on this. So we need to really zero in and figure out why we're missing the mark there. Uh, we got really good marks on these things for most things, but then one we didn't. What happened in that workshop that things went sideways? You may remember why. There was a fire alarm in the middle of it. Everybody, laughed and you weren't able to complete the workshop. So sometimes you know why that would be. But I think the main thing is to use some standard instruments and then have a way of accumulating those, adding them all up. And if you can have an evaluation framework that helps you lay out what those common questions are so that you also can compare workshops with material development, with website, with whatever you're doing, and you can start to kind of get some understandings about How do information services work, regardless of the format, whether we're using paper, whether we're doing online, whether, these are the common findings with respect to using information. These are the common things we've done to assess attitudes. Um, they're all over the map. We just can't seem to get a standard way of doing that. Here are the things for understanding whether people have actually been able to apply what they've learned, like, and try to have some standard, a grid that you're using. I've not seen anybody actually do that, so that may be a bit too idealistic, but if you can move in that direction, then you can start to accumulate that kind of
Mhm.
knowledge. It's very helpful.
Well, so that makes a lot of sense to me. Do you mind, you and I had talked earlier about sort of the range of tools and strategies that, and I think most of us know them, but I again found it sort of helpful for you to sort of go through them because there's a number of them that hadn't occurred to me.
Okay. Well, some of them are the easy, straightforward number of people who participate, number of things you distribute, what the demand seems to be in some way or another. Web analytics, of course, anybody with websites will be looking at those pop-up questions, feedback forms. Some of the ones that are not as necessarily obvious is key informant interviews. If you're dealing with people in a particular um, community? Are there some leaders in that community that will tell you, maybe more honestly, how that was received? What are they saying back in the community? Does it seem to have gone over well? Were there areas where there were problems? So key informants within whatever um, group you're trying to reach or you're working with could be the collaborating organization, but that's a loose term. But some other organization that you've drawn people from, and the same with focus groups. Can you get, if you come from a defined community, can you get some of them to come back and talk to you and tell you how it was and why it was the way it was? Sometimes focus groups are really hard to organize. I tried to do focus groups with real estate agents, and I could never get more than one person to appear at any given time because, of course, there were property managers and things like that. A crisis comes up, they can't come. Doesn't mean a one-on-one interview isn't at least as valuable. In this case, it turned out to be more valuable than a focus group. But again, if you can engage with some of the participants and get that richer, deeper understanding of why it worked for them, why they needed it. The more you understand, the better you understand people, the better your programs will be. You can do pre and post tests. They tend to be short term, like at the front end of a workshop before you come in at the end, which is one measure, but really you need that longer term, which we've already said is harder to get. But again, and relationships are so key to evaluating. If you don't have relationship with the people or their proxies, then it's going to be really hard to get the depth of understanding that you really could benefit from for your program. But if you can do some post tests somewhere down the line in some way or another, obviously that's going to be more helpful. Sometimes you have ongoing relationships and you can I work with service providers and I have ongoing relationships with them. And so I can see from one educational event of one sort or another, they're working with clients and I see them again and I can see that they have evolved in their understanding. And some of it's me, some of it's experience, but you can see that growth in people. So the hardest evaluations are where you have no relationship. Best evaluations are where you have really good relationships, substantial relationships. Again, something that you can use is the per user cost. I don't hear people talk about that very much, but if you're trying to scale things up, that sort of a thing, it helps to know what your per user cost is. So you take the budget, the amount of money it costs you to do it, divided by the number of people who came to your workshops, you've got how much it costs per person to train them. Can you bring that cost down if that's what you're looking for, or is that an incredible? I did that once and found out that what we were doing cost Albertans 25 cents per Albertan. Now, not every Albertan used it, but it was available to them. But how much, and this is something that really irritates me about funders, is you work out this unit cost and you go, we're spending, $5 to deliver this to this person. What do you expect for $5? And how much evaluation do you expect to me to engage in when it's only cost $5 to do this, So I think sometimes it's useful to have that in your hip pocket. You may not use it a lot, but you may find you use it sometimes when you weren't expecting to use it. Say, but it only costs per person this much. If they'd gone to see a lawyer, it would have cost, I know somebody who's up in the hundreds of thousands of dollars now on his legal fees. So you know, relative costs can be really important. Your own documents, again, this would be if you're doing kind of internal stuff, your own documents, records. Take a look at your proposal, what you thought you were going to be doing, how that evolved, where you made the changes. Um, your own documents can be a useful source. I've already talked about that unsolicited feedback and anecdotal. Do not diminish the importance of anecdotal. You say, how do you communicate? Well, if it's emails, you create a folder in your email and you put the stuff there. Then when you need those stories for your annual report or for a funder, you can go back in and say, well, Mary who attended X told us Y. And you can do a little nice insert into and stories are incredibly important. I think we don't talk a lot about that, but these little anecdotes, these stories that you can tell about the impact or the outcomes, whatever term you're using at that time, but what difference you made to somebody's life, often say more to a funder than anything else you can give them. So do not discount the importance of anecdotal. So is that
Yeah, that was great. So that was, yeah. Lois, on the anecdotal feedback, one of the things that perplexed me in my work was how to frame or how to explain the importance of that feedback when preparing the funding, the evaluation for the funders. How would you describe it? Would you say this is anecdotal feedback and say, it's really, how do you indicate that this is really, quality information that informs our work? How can you relate that? Any
well,
thoughts on that?
yeah, I think it depends a bit on what structure you have, what format you have for making the application. So if it's a free open proposal like we used to do, you can even start your document with the snippet of what somebody says and then attribute it to Mary, and it just sets the whole thing up. You're not claiming it's evaluation, you're claiming it's feedback. You're just telling it as a story. So you're doing the final report. You start the report with that story, and then you take it from there and say, we had and you can do your other evaluation. Say other people told us this, 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 and this. And I don't know that you have to particularly say this is anecdotal because you're not attaching a report that says we had a focus group and this is what the focus group told us. You're just embedding those stories. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes the structure, you only have 500 words to say something, and you have to decide whether the 25 words to tell your story is the best use of those 25 words or whether you need those 25 words for something else. But I think the fact that it's anecdotal, you don't have to necessarily, well, it depends on how you evaluate it. So feedback, you can put feedback, anecdotal uh, feedback. You can put
Or
that as
just
a
feedback, as you
source.
said, or just feedback.
Yeah,
Yeah,
anecdotal feedback.
yeah,
That's just you put that down. How are you going to evaluate it? Anecdotal feedback.
yeah,
There it
yeah,
is. You
yeah,
legitimized
yeah,
it.
yeah.
It doesn't have to be, and you
Okay.
can, the other thing that we haven't talked a lot about is the difference between qualitative and quantitative uh, measures.
Yes.
And the rigor, the scientific rigor that's supposed to go into these sorts of things. You get way carried away on how scientific all of this has to be. And this is where some of the cost and the scary comes in. I recently read a report where they were calling for longitudinal studies with control groups. And I'm going like, in what universe is that money ever going to be available to us? And really, what are the ethical boundaries on what we can and can't do by way of control groups and things like that? So, like, forget that. None of us can do that kind of work. Look at what you can do and be as rigorous with it as you can. So, if you have 10 anecdotes, you can sprinkle them throughout the report. If they're all saying the same thing, you can really push that point. But the other thing is with some of this qualitative feedback that we get is it tells you where to look for quantitative numbers, whether you want to. So, for example, you're getting feedback saying, yeah, I use this to help somebody. You may do a survey, ask them, how do you use this information? Well, I use it myself to do something. I use it to help somebody else. Um, and I used it to settle family arguments. Okay, you didn't expect that one to come up at all, but it did. But you don't really care. That's not why you're doing what you're doing to settle family arguments, but you do care about the others. Well, then you might do some more quantitative work to find out what percentage of people are actually using it in the way you want it to be used, as opposed to using it for these other ways, which are interesting, but not why you did the program in the first place. So you can use a combination of quantitative and qualitative, but to me, you start probably with the qualitative because that's what you want to find out how is this impacting people? What is their emotion changing? Where is that happening? Then you might do some quantitative to see if that's a really common result of what you're doing, or whether that was an outlier and most of the results are somewhere else. But most of us don't have the resources to
Yeah.
do that kind of follow-up.
Yeah.
It's enough that we learn that people are using it to help themselves, to help somebody else, whatever the main things are
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that your program's intended to
They're
do.
sort of like complementary when you can do it that
Yeah,
way. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But you can sometimes find some really interesting
Hmm. Yeah.
things people are doing that you wouldn't have expected.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about impact evaluation because funders seem to want to know about, as you said earlier, about the impact a PLEA initiative is having. And as you well know, impact can mean just about anything. So what's this about and how do you suggest we respond to it?
I think we have a slide that might help with that. Yeah. Okay. First of all, you have to decide where you want to have an impact. And right now, the dominant public legal education activities are around individuals. I've got them at the bullseye here because that's where so much public legal education is directed right now. And just out of historical interest, we were forbidden to do that at the beginning. We were not supposed to help people become their own lawyers. And now a huge amount of work is going into helping people fill out forms to appear in court, self-reps, all that kind of stuff. So we're helping people do more and more of the legal work themselves. Unbundling legal services, all this stuff has downloaded work to the individual. So our sphere there is now much more prominent than it was at the beginning. So most of us are trying to have an impact at the individual level. A lot of PLEA programs are trying to have an impact at the intermediate or professional level. I didn't have enough circles to separate those, but what I was getting at with professionals is sometimes you want to have an impact on lawyers. And it's not something we always think about with public legal education, but we're trying to change lawyers' attitudes or ability to serve people. Lawyers we discovered were primary users of public legal education resources when we started because it helped them if they had a mixed practice, but they didn't do a lot of work in some area. They'd look at our plea materials to kind of get started in that area, but it particularly helped them to communicate with their clients, which was really important. If we provide resources that are in plain language, then lawyers can use plain language better with their clients. So that's an area, intermediaries we know we're trying to influence, but we need to think about some of the other professionals that we might be trying to influence too. Um, there's I've got community and organization joined together. They're not meant to really be the same, but we do work with nonprofit organizations to help with their governance or to help them provide better services or understand some aspect of of their work that it takes them into legal area, but their main work isn't a legal service. I think we talked about this in one of the other workshops, but they do have a legal dimension and they need to understand better where the lines are, how to make referrals or whatever. Community side of things is PLEAC can do a lot to help with community development, to improve infrastructure in communities, their capacity to help each other, uh, doing some interesting work with that right now, where PLEA has been an organizing tool. The community had not identified leaders that were not in any way kind of a coherent group. And the PLEA initiative went in, started to identify some of those leaders, started bringing them together, and started to get them working together as a community. So we don't often think of that as being a possible impact for PLEA. Systemic, as I say, we may have contributed to changing the family law system, but library training of libraries, science students, there are various systems. We might be changing health care systems in some way. We don't think of that, but we may actually have that intended. And then the societal, um, this is more an act of faith, I guess, that the fact that plea exists, that our country values informing the public about the law, I think says a lot about our society. I think we are a different society. We have had an impact on Canada, and what it means to be a Canadian, to have access to this legal information and some of the other, training and services that we brought into being. So, impact evaluation, going back to the slide on the logic model, is that last part of the model. What is the ultimate goal? What's the ultimate impact? And usually, short term, you know what that's going to be. You want to improve somebody's understanding. You want to have more skills. But the ultimate long term, well, nobody's ever funded us to find that. So, but we're often expected to say what we think that will be, and sometimes funders expect us to have an impact on this systemic impact. So, I don't know if that gets at your question, Julie. What's it all about? Uh, I think in part funders grasp at straws. I don't know if there's funders in the audience, but they look for a silver bullet. They would love to have impacts for us to prove we're having an impact, and an impact they want. I think that's the other side of an impact. They may not like the impact we're having if we actually could track it. They may not be that happy that we brought family court to its knees. Like that may not have been a desirable impact from the point of view of the funder. So, but I mean, we don't know. And the other thing is that we contribute to impacts. We are not the sole cause of an impact. We contribute to an impact. And figuring out what your contribution is versus the contribution of legal aid versus the contribution of the judges versus, you can't really, we contributed, but we can't put a number or a percentage on the contribution we made. But the further out you go, the more variables there are, the more watered down our contribution probably is.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so webinar participants, please feel free to ask any questions of Lois that you might have. And in the meantime, I had a couple of sort of like questions that I wanted to ask her if we had time, and I'll start with the first of them, which is that as we know, you've done a lot of research looking at the evaluation of PLEA in Canada over the last many decades. And how has that, and you alluded to this earlier, but how has plea evaluation evolved over the years? I mean, I know that's a big question, but can you just maybe give us some high points?
Well, one of the things that's interesting for me is both the development of evaluation as a field and plea have really quite similar origins. We both grew out of some of the war on poverty effort in the United States that was replicated in various ways in Canada. It wasn't the same, but there were some. But that's where a lot of the legal services came from. neighborhood legal services. Ontario and BC particularly have a lot of the kinds of things that were being developed back then. But huge amounts of money were being spent on anti-poverty programs. And so there was a lot of pressure on the government to say, well, are they working or aren't they working? Working, what's not working? And so the field of evaluation, if it existed before then, got a real boost on that. Another area in which it's really developed has been in foreign aid of one sort or another, where we've put massive amounts of money into countries, and the question is it the right thing? Not just are we doing it right, but is it the right thing? So there's been a lot of money parallel to our development. Obviously, we haven't had any of that money. We've had dribs and drabs of money, but we have followed the progress of that. So the initial evaluation was on outputs, like counting the things, bums and seats, we used to say, and the number of brochures and things like that. So it was all very quantitative, but didn't really tell you anything very much, except you could get the unit cost of some of these things. So there have been various waves of things as it's moved forward, and we've been subjected to many of those along the way. Um, you can't quantify the benefits. I think I've covered that already, because there was a whole bunch of quantitative stuff going on. You can't quantitate the benefits of public legal education. Quality does not come in numbers. And so we have to have the qualitative methods. That's the other thing that's evolved over the same period of time, more or less. And we thank nurses for doing a lot of this work. Nurses were trying to establish themselves as a proper area of university faculty. And to be university faculty, you had to have research. So the medical people said, well, we're doing all the research. Why would nurses be doing research? We do the research. And so they said, well, we're going to research different things than you do. We're going to research the care people get, how they're responding, and how we can do better nursing. And to do that, they had to develop qualitative research methods. And so they were a major source of energy around college. So all these things have been evolving, and we're still evolving all of that. And PLEI is evolving as well at the same time. And we have new, like we didn't have the internet when we started. The internet threw open a whole bunch of opportunities that we didn't have for mass reach, but created its own problems. So now we're trying to figure out how to deal with the limitations of the internet and social media and all these kinds of things. So it's very dynamic field.
Okay, well, and I'll hold off on that other optional question, which is what have we learned from all that? But even though it's like it's begging to be asked, a couple of people have commented on how interesting it is that lawyers are large users of PLEI. One comment was that we find this more and more, and most recently at our display at CBA conferences. We, for years, also had a small ad campaign aimed at lawyers with the repeated message, an informed client is a better client. That's brilliant in my view. So far, no lawyer has disagreed. And then there is a question as well. Do you have some kind of, this kind of relates, I think, to the next session today, but do you have some kind of, or know of some kind of an indicators bank of indicators that can be useful regarding evaluation of PLEI tools?
I don't. And we in PLEA have also tried to come up with some way of creating some common ways of recording what we do so that we could report collectively, say to the Department of Justice, saying you're funding this much across the country, and collectively here's what we're doing. But we ran into a couple of things definitional. What's a brochure? What's a training session? What's a, and no energy to try to standardize that, because what was the point? You're doing the training that the people need that you're working with. Whether you call it a training program or something else, does it have to be certain length of time or to have skills, or so we couldn't standardize our vocabulary. Plus there were very different things going on across the country. So we had puppet shows, nobody else had puppet shows. People had theater productions. You just
Yeah.
we weren't doing the same thing. Some people had camps, law camps for kids. So we couldn't we've never been able to figure that out. I know this afternoon we're going to talk about a catalog. I think that's a much more productive activity than we've had before, where we're just using fairly generic terms, like everybody's feedback form is not going to be the same, but we are using feedback forms. And perhaps in time we can get some samples. So you can say, oh, I never thought of asking that question. Oh, I've never used that form of a feedback. So I think if we can get some of that and then get some samples, it will be really helpful.
Yeah, that's the idea this afternoon. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you spoke a little bit about how PLEI evaluation has evolved over the many years. Is there anything in particular sort of that stands out as to what we've learned through that evolution?
Um, well, the first, and I keep harping on this, but it's really major. We spent the first probably decade trying to establish that PLEI was legitimate. Like, why should we fund PLEI? Why should we fund PLEI? And we just get so sick of answering that question. We never knew what the magic answer was because it's the responsibility of the executive branch, or because people have these problems, or because we could prevent, like we never knew what the answer was to that question. We just keep being asked it as if we kept missing the mark. But eventually that faded because by then we were starting to have some of this evaluation feedback. So what have we learned? We learned we're really a valuable player in the legal ecosystem. We have definitely established a place there. Some of the things that we do are absolutely valued, as the previous person said, like who knew lawyers would respond the way they have to the idea that an informed client is a much better client, but they sure didn't at the beginning. So some of these things we've learned not necessarily through formal evaluation, but through the experience, which matters. When the formal evaluation, we can have all the formal evaluations we want, proving how good we are, and lawyers not being willing to support us, and lawyers control law foundations by and large. So, that's been huge. We have learned that. We have proven ourselves in that way. And one of the other things we've learned really is there's no such thing as the general public. I know we tend to use that term without necessarily being really clear about what we're talking about, but rather there are publics. And depending on what you're doing, you would define the public differently. But we spent a lot of time early in the week talking about all the barriers just at the technological side of accessing online resources. And then there's all the barriers to actually using any of the information that you get. So the people who really benefit most from some of these things are people who are least disadvantaged. That's double negative, but who have the most going for them. They have the most resources. They have the personal skills and abilities to use the information. And people who are more marginalized are necessarily not going to be able to make good use of some of those resources. So it's really important to think about who it is that you're trying to reach. And as I think I said earlier, translating stuff for people who are never going to get near your site is a waste of money. So you need to consider very carefully who you think is going to benefit from the service and whether you really have understood their needs well enough. So no such thing as the general public. Zero in on which you want. Look at what assumptions you're making. So when you're talking about the general public, what are you assuming? You assuming they can function in English. You can assume that they have a certain literacy level, that they're familiar with problem solving. They've got good skills for and confidence in doing it, that they can deal with authority, all those sorts of things. So the other thing that has happened, I think, is that those services in particular tend to be very transactional. You put the stuff up, they take it. You'd have no relationship really with the person who's using it versus these other services. And that's where I think the trend is going to be in public legal education, if we really want to have an impact, is going to be in working more closely with communities of one sort or another, with those trusted relationships that will actually get some traction going. It's where we started, and I'm happy to see that's being revived, and we're getting back to that. Um, I think we've certainly learned a lot about using intermediaries. I think we did it out of necessity at the beginning because that was the only way to distribute throughout geographically and to some of the more marginalized, hard to reach groups. Um, So I think that has evolved. I was really excited about the presentation about the work being done in the States to credential, to properly train and credential some of these intermediary type services. So I think we've learned that intermediaries are a very viable way to go. They're expensive in some respects, but um, if they're more effective than some of the cheaper or the lower unit cost that aren't really doing very much, then it's false economy to go the cheaper route. And if we really want to reach these communities, really want them to become part of the Canadian fabric in a meaningful way, then we're going to have to invest in this other kind of work. So I don't, was there something you were thinking about that you think we've established?
I think you covered it, Lois. And even if there were something, I thought we're almost out of time, and
Oh,
I just want to pull up a couple of the comments. Joel again added, and this is pretty interesting, that they've been around long enough, and some of the rest of us have too, to hear lawyers say, you are taking away from our business. Haven't heard this for a very long time now, so that shifted. Um, and there is a question, Lois, and I think we have a minute or so for
okay.
you to answer it. Is there a need or an effort to move the needle on the way funders understand the context of evaluating education-based interventions?
I am not privy to the inner workings of funders at all, but there is generally they've evolved, they learn. That leadership can sometimes come from one funder and another time another funder. They backslide. So I think, I mean, I believe in progress. Not everybody does, but I think they get better. They get better at this. And again, the more they listen, the better. And this, I come back to these listening skills. Funders want to tell you stuff. You got a real uphill battle to convince them that what you're doing is, if it's different, is valued. Funders who will listen can learn. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we need to wrap this up. I found that to be such a good overview, both, practical, informative, and my key takeaways, Lois, were ask, listen, record, and learn and improve and share with funders as needed. Don't be intimidated. So that was great to hear, and thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise today. And thanks everybody for attending. And over to you, Hannah, to wrap up properly.
Oh, you did great, Julie. Thank you so much. I just really quickly wanted to say, echoing Julie, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a lot of great comments and feedback in the chat, so thank you. And a huge thank you to Lois. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights with us today. It's been absolutely wonderful. And Julie, thank you so much for helping move the conversation. We really appreciate it, of course. So if you're registered for our next session, is sort of around the same topic of evaluation and a little more of a discussion there. Feel free to join us. It's at 1:45 or in 30 minutes or so. If you haven't signed up, there's still time to join us. But if not, thank you again, everyone. And if you've been participating the past 2 days, that's been wonderful, and we really appreciate it as well. So thank you, and hope to see you in a bit.
thank you, Hannah. You've been fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Lois. Thanks, Julie. See you, everyone.